So, good morning, everybody.
Well, everybody knows me now. You don't need to do any introductions.
I don't need to make a big introduction. Richard Barrett. I will just speak about the content of this day that we are working together. In the beginning, the first hour is a presentation of Richard about improvisation and including a demonstration of his instrument that he uses since many years and is always changing. Live electronic instrument for improvisation. And afterwards, from 11 to 1, we have the first session together with our students, where we set up our instruments and start doing some exercises under the guidance of Professor Barrett.
Nothing too strenuous.
It can be. And afterwards, we have a lunch break for 1 hour. This goes until 2, if I'm not mistaken. And then we have another session from 2 to 5, where we work on, let's say, constellations, pieces, different combinations of instruments. And in the evening at 6, we have a concert that includes our findings, so to speak. And afterwards, we go out for drinks to the Greek restaurant that you all know in the Stadtpark, Heumarkt. There's some sound coming out. Okay, I give the word to Richard.
Okay,
welcome in Vienna.
I'm going to come out from behind the table for a while. Hopefully, maybe I'll stand on this side because everybody's on this side. So, welcome everyone. First of all, I want to say a few general things about improvisation, since that's my role here at the moment, and then I'm going to talk more about the instrument that I've been developing over the years for performing not just improvised music, but other methods as well. Now, the first thing I want to say then is a more general observation about improvisation and what it means. So, I had what was for me a very important realization about 22 years ago, which sorted out, I suppose, some contradictions that I felt existed in my musical thinking until then. Because until that point, around about 2002, I had been working on rather intricately notated music, which some of you have maybe seen, and at the same time working on various forms of free improvisation in various different groups, some of which remained constant over a longer period and some of which were kind of ad hoc formations like we're going to have today. And for a long time, if somebody had asked me, well, what do these two things that you do have in common, I would have found it very difficult to answer that question. But at the same time, it was a question which bothered me a great deal. And the realization came from, well, it was a realization that how we define these terms is actually quite important in how we relate, or how I related these different activities to one another. And the center of that realization is that we can think of composition, the word composition that is, as denoting any kind of musical creative process, something which results in music being created. And we can think of the word improvisation as denoting one particular method of doing that. And in fact, the method which depends most profoundly on spontaneous actions and reactions. So improvisation, therefore, is a method of composition, alongside the various methods that we can use to create notated composition or fixed media composition, or what have you. So that realization freed me up to begin thinking about how these different methods might relate to one another, and which possibilities might be opened up by thinking of the different methods of composition, from improvisation to other methods, as being a kind of constellation of different ways to approach musical creativity, each of which has its own kind of range of possibilities with regard to structure, with regard to the poetic content of a composition, the expressive content of a composition, and so forth. And I realized that the reason why I'd been interested in these two seemingly diametrically opposed ways of creating music was that actually the results end up having a great deal in common with one another. But that each has its own possibilities with regard to with regard to both the poetic and the structural aspects of music. And both also offer different ways of entering into collaborative relationships with other creative musicians. Because I always thought of myself, when working on notated compositions, most of the work that I've done, in fact, has been the result of several rather long-term relationships with particular musicians, particular ensembles. For example, the Elysian Ensemble, which is based in Australia, I started working with in 1990, and approximately half of the music I've written since then, and that is maybe 50 or 60 separately performable compositions, has been written with those people in mind. So in that situation, I see myself as a collaborator, as a member of the ensemble, but the member who is producing scores rather than producing sounds, so to speak. And as time has gone on, I've put myself increasingly into the ensemble as a performer as well. So I would like to see notated composition ideally as a situation where the composer and the performers are not on different levels in some kind of hierarchy, but are collaborating with one another with a particular musical aim in mind. And of course that brings it much closer to the idea of improvisation, where you will have a number of people working together, pooling their imaginations and intelligences to produce a music which is the result of a sort of composite personality that comes into being at the confluence of all of those different imaginations and intelligences working together. One of the characteristics of notated composition and fixed media composition, which I hold as very valuable, is the idea that when you're working on when you're working with this kind of method, you are able to stand outside the composition, so to speak, to stand outside the flow of time in the composition, and to see, as it were, the time dimension of the music as a spatial dimension. Imagine, for example, that you set all the pages of the score from left to right on the floor, and that time span you can see as a spatial extent. A related phenomenon to that, of course, is the invention of magnetic tape in the 1940s, where again a sound can become an object, and the sound object, of course, was a very important concept in a number of strands of development of electronic music from the 1950s onwards. The idea that a sound can be represented as a physical object which can be sculpted in a rather plastic kind of way. Anyway, returning to these methods of composition. So I felt, therefore, that the ability that we have to stand outside the time dimension of a composition is something which we should take full advantage of when composing in that kind of domain. So, for example, I suppose classic procedure of beginning at the start of a composition and working one's way through to the end is only one among very many different possibilities. And one of the important developments that I decided to, important for me I should say, that I decided to work on at that point was to compose the act of composition. That is, to compose the order in which a composition would be created. So that, for example, it could start from a number of different focal points and gradually grow outwards from them until the focal points would overlap with one another. Or it could start at the end and work back to the beginning, or in the middle and work out in both directions, or it could be laid down like a series of archaeological or geological strata, so that one strand of the music might be composed first and then others added to it, and maybe the original one taken away sometimes as well. So the practice then of notated and fixed media composition allows that spatialization of time, which is something that I would want to take full advantage of. Now, of course, the spatialization of time is not available in an improvisational situation, but that allows different possibilities to come into being. And many criticisms of improvisation, free improvisation, when it began in the 1960s, for example, you hear Pierre Boulez talking about this, is that the practice of improvisation had a tendency to cause performers to fall back on familiar ideas when they were working on improvisation. And when you think about that, then you might think to yourself, well, what about composers of notated music? They very often fall back on familiar ideas as well. So that's not a characteristic of improvisation. It's a characteristic of composers who are not thinking clearly enough about what they're doing, perhaps, because we can all think of composers who repeat themselves with familiar ideas for their whole lives, and we can also think of improvisers who do exactly the opposite of that. So I don't think that improvisation is to do with dredging up kind of familiar ideas from your subconscious and putting them into your instrument, but it should be something which is more generative than that. The strongest influence on what you do in a given improvisational piece is firstly the memory you have of what has happened up until that moment, and secondly the anticipation that you have of what might happen next. So the present moment is something which is moving through the time span of the improvised composition, and during that time, of course, the amount of material or the amount of memory which is influencing what happens in the moment is gradually growing, and then the anticipation of what might happen next eventually is going to collapse down onto the end of the piece. And what's very interesting about that is that the audience is in exactly the same situation of anticipating what might happen next and remembering what has happened up until that time. And that's how we can understand and appreciate the structure of an improvisation. And so that's something that we'll be working on practically a little bit later on when we start with the workshop. What I want to move on to now is something about to take a more kind of historical perspective on improvisation as well. Now, unlike most ways of making music, most methods of composition, I should say, a lot of the time people begin with improvisation as if they're starting from nothing, as if improvisation has not existed up until that time, and as if the history of it has no role to play in what they do, which is kind of a shame in a way. I mean, it's possible to do that, obviously, but I find that there are some important insights to be gained from looking at where free improvisation comes from, and why it happened at a particular time. Because you look back in history round about the beginning of the 1960s, and both musicians from the jazz tradition and musicians from the composition tradition seem to light on this idea of free improvisation at more or less the same time. And a lot of the time they would also collaborate with one another. They would be the same people. Why did it happen then? Well, I think that has a lot to do with the idea that we associate with the music and ideas of John Cage, which is that there is no sound which is a priori an unmusical sound. So one possible extension of that idea is that any combination of sounds can also be a musical combination of sounds. And that whether it's musical or not is not really a useful question to ask anymore, as opposed to what kind of, as Cage would say, how it creates the conditions for an interesting and engaging music to be made. And so once we get to the point of thinking that any combination of sounds can be a musical combination of sounds, then that makes free improvisation immediately possible, because it means that it's no longer necessary, as it was thought up until that time, to be planning how sounds are going to interact with one another in a composition, but it's something that can be created in real time. So for that reason, I think, and another reason which I'll come to in a second, I think that the advent of free improvisation in the 1960s was an extremely important step in the development of musical thinking. And another reason for that is looking at what the role is of structure in free improvisation. Now, of course, we know that improvisation has existed in every musical culture in the world forever. It's clear that the first music that was ever made was, in a certain sense, improvised from objects, voices that people happen to find around them. But something that emerges from most, if not all, of the traditions in which we find improvisation is that there is always something we can call a consensual framework within which the improvisation takes place. So if we look at Middle Eastern music, for instance, we have a situation where there is a certain melodic line which is stretching through the music, which is being realized differently by different musicians at the same time, which is a condition called heterophony, as you probably know. And the same kind of idea emerges, well, as a result of influence from the Arab world in European music of the Middle Ages, the monodic music, which would be realized in this heterophonic way by different ornamentations of the same melodic line taking place simultaneously. If we move on a few hundred years to the Baroque period, we have the system of tonal relations, tonal harmonic relations, which form a framework within which improvisation can take place. So there are various compositions like the Chromatic Fantasy and Fugue of Bach, or the G minor Fantasia of Mozart, which seem to have the quality about them of written out improvisations. That there is a system of tonal relations which creates a kind of preferred pathway for an improvisation to go down, such that certain harmonies are more often than not followed by certain other harmonies, less often by other categories. So there is a kind of system of physical laws in the tonal framework which enables the musician and the audience to make sense of all the pathways that the musician makes through this landscape. So there the framework is the system of tonal relations, which of course has never remained constant through musical history, but has always allowed and disallowed various things according to what position in history we're in. And I'm not going to go into the history of harmony because I'm sure you hear enough about that from other people. But then if we move on to the 20th century and the jazz tradition, then there's a very clear consensual structure that exists there as well in terms of a tempo and groove which is laid down by the rhythm section, and also the harmonic changes which go along with that, which then serve to provide a context for the soloing of the soloist. So all of those forms of improvisation, from the Middle Ages to the Baroque period to jazz, involve a framework which exists prior to the music, which has been agreed on by the musicians in advance. And I think this is another way in which free improvisation is a big step out of previous methods of making music, which is that what we are doing when we're improvising freely is we are creating that structural framework at the same time as creating the sounds. So it's not a music which has no structure. It's a music whose structure is coming into being spontaneously as a result of the interactions between the musicians taking part. And I think that's quite an important, for me, that's quite an important aspect to bear in mind. Of course, other improvisers would say, no, that's completely wrong, I don't think of it that way. And if we look at a very famous book by the improvising guitarist Derek Bailey called Improvisation, Its Nature and Practice, which was first published in 1972, what Derek did was he interviewed musicians who were involved in various forms of improvisation and basically collected their ideas together. And then the most interesting chapter of the book is when he talks about his own approach to improvisation and how that relates to all of these traditions that he's been writing about previously. One of the things that he says is that in free improvisation, some people say that it involves a deep historical knowledge of improvisational traditions. Other people say that it's something that you start anew whenever you play. And then he also says that some people would say that it's something that requires the development of a instrumental vocal technique of virtuoso dimensions, whereas other people say it doesn't require any instrumental technique whatsoever. And as I was just saying, some people would say that it's something where a musical structure is being brought into being at the confluence of the imaginations and intelligences taking part, whereas other people would say, no, that's nonsense, there's no structure at all, it's just something that happens. But the point I want to make with all that is that all of these things are true, and they can all be true simultaneously. And that, to me, is one of the most important aspects of creative music in a wider sense, which is that it's something which can not so much reconcile contradictions, but something where contradictions become a creative aspect of the music rather than an obstacle to it. And I think that's a very important point for why we are making what might be called experimental music or whatever, what the importance of it is. And for a start, you have the idea that free improvisation is a collaboration between equals and is therefore potentially a model for a society of equals where contradictions and confrontations, let's say, are not an obstacle to the functioning of that society, but actually an energizing aspect to the functioning of that society. So we can use improvisation as a model for how a harmonious society might operate. And I think that these times in which we're living now are calling out for models like that, ways of imagining how we can live together in a different way from the way that's forced upon us by the social, political structures that we live in. And another thing is, of course, that whether we're talking about improvisation or other methods of composition, possibly the most important thing that we can contribute as experimental musicians on the kind of obscure fringes of the musical world to musical thinking more generally is the fact that what we do is not circumscribed by the expectations of the commercial world or any other system of values, but something which is free to explore musical possibilities much more freely than that. So I think that we need to be very careful, not just to find our own directions with the creative work that we do, so as to demonstrate the possibility of a freedom that doesn't exist generally in the social systems we live in. But also we have to include the so-called contemporary music world within those systems as well, that we have to be free of that too. That we should not be submitting ourselves to any kind of pre-existing institutional system of values, but we should be constantly demonstrating our independence from those things and the possibility of a freedom which goes beyond them. And I think that working on improvisation is, for me, certainly a very integral part of that activity, because I think we should certainly be very aware of what the potential, not so much social impact, but social relevance of what we're doing is. And that doesn't consist in submitting ourselves to somebody else's idea of what is acceptable or somebody else's idea of what is accessible. But on the other hand, as I say, once more demonstrating the possibility of the infinite freedom of the human imagination. Okay, so I'll stop with that for the moment and move on to something a little bit more practical. And let me see how the time is going. Okay. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about my own history. Sorry to keep moving, Karlheinz. Come back and forth all the time. But I think it's important to point out that my involvement in improvisation actually begins not with electronic music, but it begins with playing the guitar. And when I started working on improvised music as a guitarist, when I was in my early 20s, of course I got very interested in the sort of lo-fi aspect of using guitar pedals and these kinds of rather crude ways of transforming the sound of the instrument, until I formed, together with some friends, a group in the mid-1980s, and we played a few concerts. There were 4 or 5 of us, depending on circumstances. And at one point, one of my colleagues in this group brought along a little sampling keyboard, which was manufactured by Casio in the 1980s, which was about this size, and had a tiny little keyboard on it, and it was able to sample sounds up to 1.5 seconds in, I think, less than 8-bit quality. I'm not quite sure what the sound quality was. And I found this absolutely fascinating at this point, because one of the things that I found restrictive about working as a guitarist was that I was kind of tied to the technique of what you do when you play the guitar. You pluck a string with one hand and you stop it with the other, or some other combination of the two. It requires practice and a sense of a physical relation to a particular kind of sonic articulation. And when I was a student, I was working quite often in the theatre group of the university where I was studying. That was studying biological sciences back then. And one of my friends in the theatre group at the time said, well, the great thing about being a director in the theatre is that it's like playing all the roles, because if you can't decide which of the roles you think is important to play in a particular piece, then you should be the director, because then you can play all of them. And so this is what sampling technology brought to me at the time. It was like, I would actually like to be able to play all of the instruments. And that's one reason why I was writing notated music. But if I'm using this sampling keyboard, I can play all the instruments. And it was, as I say, very crude and low-tech at that time. But what I was hearing in what I was doing there was something that probably nobody else could hear. Because what I was hearing was my vision of what that music could be if I wasn't working with this little toy. So in developing the music later on in the 1990s towards the use of more up-to-date technology like first professional quality hardware samplers and then ultimately computers, the reason I'm saying all this is that I never lost sight of where this process began. And it began with guitars and effects pedals, and therefore in something where the idea of distortion, the idea of turning distortion, which is ultimately a malfunction of the instrumental system, into something which is actually a characteristic of it. So something that starts off as something that you don't want ends up being a characteristic of the instrument that you're working with. And there's an interesting little essay by Brian Eno which talks about how the unpleasant characteristics of any sound-producing medium eventually become the aspects that people are most attracted to, whether it's distortion in guitars or whether it's the kind of potential glitchiness of digital audio, or for that matter, the distortion that arises from the characteristics of vinyl and record playback and so forth. So I think that's quite an interesting idea to bear in mind as well. It's not to do with low technology and high technology, but it's to do with recognizing the creative potential of the kind of cracks in the wall of this kind of smooth world of digital sound that we're presented with now. So what I was doing in the early 1990s then was working with hardware samplers, and the next big step forward for me came when I started using a laptop as the sound producing device. And there I was using a software which had been developed at the Steim Studio for Electro-Instrumental Music in Amsterdam. I was living in Amsterdam at that time and working very regularly at this studio where they developed a software called LISA. And LISA stands for Live Sampling. And this was a system which was designed by the programmers at Stein for the late Michel Weisvis, who was a performer of improvised electronic music. And what he wanted was a system which would allow him to make samples of whatever was going on around him and to manipulate those in real time using what would now be called a glove controller. So a very early example of a non-keyboard MIDI controller. So Lisa was set up to have a single sound buffer, at first mono and subsequently stereo, which could be read into in real time, played back in real time, and the buffer, if we imagine it as like a window on a digital audio workstation, was something that could be used then as a kind of sculptural object, which could be played in various ways, playback pointers moved in different directions, pitches shifted, stretched, and different kinds of patterns superimposed on the playback and so forth. And so when I started working with that, I thought I don't really want to work with the live sampling thing because that seems to me a little bit too, I'm not interested in that aspect of chance in music. But what I would like to do is I would like to compose these sound buffers and to have a bank of them which I would then be able to use in many different situations. So I used that system for many years. Actually, I was recalling with Karlheinz the other day that the first time I used it was in a concert that we played together in Linz. And that was the first time that I used the laptop on stage, because as with all of these things, and I'll come to another little story about this presently, I find that I have to force myself to take the next technological step. So when I came to Austria to play this concert, I thought, okay, this is going to be the first time I take the laptop on stage, and just to make sure that that's the case, I'm not going to take my hardware sampler with me, so that I have to make it work, and I have to make it work on stage in this concert on the stage. Subsequently, the Lisa software was somewhat abandoned by Stein, and Stein itself doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. And so I had to think of, okay, what do I do now? So what I thought of doing, which is what we see here, is porting this concept that I took from Lisa into the form of a max patch. But what I could do then is remove all of the things that I didn't need like the live sampling capability, and add various things that I thought should have been there in the Lisa software. So what I have with this Max patch now, which was first used, I guess about 10 years ago, and has been developing a little bit since then, is not just something that was invented on the spot, but it's something that has its roots, first of all, in the use of the Lisa software, before that in the way that hardware samplers operated, particularly those from the Ensoniq company, and before that the lo-fi approach of using electric guitars and effects pedals. So all of that history is somehow encapsulated in the way that the instrument is constructed. And so I'm going to show a few things now. You can see the instrument here, and you can see that actually there are a large number of controllers on the table. You have a keyboard, you have tablet, you have faders, there are 3 pedals underneath the table, and we also have the computer, which has just gone to sleep. And what the patch does then is it loads in a sample of 5 minutes duration, and I have 200 of these now. So there's a lot of material that can be used. And new samples can be loaded in fairly quickly, so that doesn't really break up the playing too much. And each one of these 5-minute samples is composed according to different kinds of musical characteristics. So the one that I have in here now, for example, I can show you a few bits of it here. So as we step through the sample, then we get the same pitch in different timbral forms. So if you were to scroll all the way through it, which I can do here, so this is the beginning. So there are 3 main regions there, and they are centered on the same pitch in different octaves. And all I've done just now is to scroll through that 5-minute sample from start to finish. And there are other 5-minute buffers then which consist of hundreds of different sounds. I'll give you an example of that. This one is one of the earliest ones. And it consists of mostly taken from CDs, a huge variety of different sound materials. So that's a kind of collage which consists of many hundreds of sounds. And how do we access this 5-minute sample? Well, there are various ways of doing it which are different for the 4 octaves of the keyboard. And before I go on, I should say this is one of the things that I added to the Lisa setup when I ported the instrument to Max, and that is that whereas Lisa is intended basically as a monophonic instrument, although of course I was using it in various less monophonic ways, what I decided to do in the Max version is to divide the keyboard into 4 octaves, and basically those are 4 different instruments. So on the fader box here I have a fader which controls the volume of each of the 4 octaves, so they can be mixed in separately from one another. And I have a sustain pedal here which can be reconfigured either to sustain everything like a piano, or to sustain only 1 or 2 of the 4 octaves, so as produce different kinds of layered textures. And while I'm on the fader box, there is also the second group of 4 faders here, which controls the reverb mix of the 4 levels. So if I'm producing the same kind of sound on different levels and cross-fading between them, I can also use the reverberation faders to put those sounds at different distances, so to speak. And then what we have on these 2 faders here is the depth and frequency of an LFO, which is controlling, in this case, a square wave for pitch shifting. So it produces, let's go back to the original sound, and I can show you what's happening there. So, I'll go back to the original one. So, and that doesn't have to be a square wave, it can be a triangle wave, it can be a random function, whatever. So that's something which can be added in different situations. I find when I'm playing with acoustic instruments, I very often use the triangle wave function so as to be able to match the vibrato of an acoustic instrument. So we've looked at that. These 4 knobs here are very important because what they do is they control the pitch bend range of each of the 4 octaves in turn. And this is where one of the most important characteristics of this instrument comes in, which is that, well, I'm not a keyboard player, so I felt myself free to reconceive this set of switches according to the characteristics that I wanted it to have. So what we see here is if I touch that key, then you always get the same sound. But if I start to increase the pitch bend range here, what happens is that the key velocity begins to control the output pitch. So here, for example, I can try and play a microtonal scale by just hitting the key harder and softer. I haven't practiced this, so it might not be very good. So, and then of course that can be increased to a very great extent so that velocity has an enormous effect on the pitch that comes out. And that serves to, let's go back to the other sample again. That can give rise to very many different characteristics just by using a single key, moving the playback pointer around, maybe with this hand, and at the same time altering the pitch using velocity. So if I move on to the tablet here, what you see is there are 6 faders. This one is a pitch bend control. The faders are set up so that they jump immediately to their new values. So if I'm going to play something with this high degree of pitch bend, this fader on the tablet becomes a very expressive way of altering the pitch using vibrato, using trills, and different ways of ornamenting the sound. And what we have here, let's stay with this for the moment. This fader only affects what happens in the lowest octave. And it operates a shift in the time stretch. That's that, and then there's another controller here, which is a kind of macro controller where, let's find a good place. What this does is it controls the speed at which the loop playback point is varying randomly. These two controllers are controlling the coarse and fine playback position, and this is controlling the loop length. And here's another important issue that comes into this instrument, which is that there are two different controllers for the loop length. I don't always have a free finger to operate it there, so the same parameter is controlled by two different controllers. And there are various other buttons here. This one switches on and off the jitter I was just talking about. This resets the coarse loop position to a random value. This resets the pitch bend to a random value. And the other things then are connected to increasing the value of the loop position by a single MIDI value, so these things can be controlled very precisely. Let's see. So this is gradually moving the loop point. Gives a much finer control over some of the parameters. Now, looking at the keyboard, there is one particular characteristic that I want to add to what I've said already, which is that, as you've seen, the lowest octave of the keyboard is concerned with a time stretch algorithm. Otherwise, it's entirely comparable with the second one, because what happens is that I divide the 5-minute sample into 12 times 25 seconds, and the loop position of each of the 12 keys in the first two octaves is able to move through that 25 seconds, so it has a much finer control over the loop playback position. But it also means that different kinds of areas of the sound are available to each of the keys in each of those two octaves. So when the 5-minute samples are constructed, very often they're constructed in 12 chunks of 25 seconds, which might have different kinds of sound materials in them. So these then are controlled by the 12 keys of this octave and this octave. And what happens in the third octave, which I at the moment don't use so often, is that it divides instead of 12 times 25 seconds, it divides the buffer into 4 times 100 seconds. so that each 3 keys works on the same area. So then we can, what if I'm being completely clear here, but if we put the pedal down, find a place. So now we have the same area of the sample being played back at 3 different pitches, according to the velocity of these 3 different keys. And then what happens with the top octave is that it is able to scan through the entire 5-minute buffer, as you saw before. So that it can start at the beginning and then work its way up. But obviously that doesn't give you a very fine control. So everything in the way the instrument is constructed is to do with various degrees of precision that one can have when operating on this 5-minute buffer. Some of the ways of playing might end up having quite clearly random characteristics to them, but then that's something that gives me the possibility of reacting in real time to something which is a little bit unpredictable. And the unpredictability of instruments is something that particularly interests me as a composer anyway. Finding those areas of instability where this can be an acoustic instrument or a modular synthesizer for that matter, areas of instability where small changes in control parameters can give rise to very big changes in the output sound. But what we have in this instrument is we have that possibility, but we also have the possibility of being very precise with taking a kind of microscopic view of the sound material and being able to control it very deterministically. So that whole range between randomness and instability on the one hand, and stability and predictability on the other hand, is built into the way that the instrument operates. And as you've noticed, some of the parameters are real-time controllers, for example, for pitch. Some of them are controllers of controllers, for example, the pitch bend range controls. Some of them are inputting random information which can be used in different ways, like resetting the pitch randomly within the pitch bend range. And there are various other things which I'm not going to dwell on now because we are going to run out of time soon, but there's a whole kind of filtering system there as well, which I'm not going to talk about because I don't use it very much at this point. What else? The sustain pedal I talked about. So that's the sound engine there is based on a model which goes back a number of decades, and as I say, I now have 200 or so 5-minute sound buffers which are able to be used in all kinds of different musical situations. And one more thing to say about that is that there are some of those buffers that I know very well, that I can play it like an instrument, so to speak, because I know exactly what's going to happen, and I know every detail of the 5-minute buffer, and I can find my way around it with my eyes closed, so to speak. And there are others which I might, in any given concert, not have used at all before. So my exploration of the possibilities of those sound buffers is something that's taking place in real time in the performance. And then there are various others which are kind of in between, or maybe I used them for a while a few years ago, and then I kind of forgot what they were all about, and then came back to them and found different ways of operating with them. So the instrument has developed kind of concentrically like a tree. So the various rings in the tree trunk show the seasons that it's gone through, and so this tree is really quite wide now. So we can look back in time to the previous sound materials that I was using and find ourselves in different musical areas. So the familiarity of the material is also a factor which I'm consciously working with in the performance. And I guess that more or less concludes what I have to say about the instrument. I should say that it's something which I've developed not just for use in improvisation, but as an instrument which can be used in more precise compositions as well. And one of the aspects built into the patch, which I'm not really going to talk about now, is that it's also capable of loading up and playing back sound files, which might then serve to give a kind of structural backbone to a live performance. And the pause and resume of the playback of these sound files is then controlled by the top two keys of the keyboard here. So they become pause and play buttons when I have that fixed media material loaded in. So there's one solo piece which I started playing, I think about 5 years ago, where the fixed media part and the sound buffer in the instrument are exactly the same. So the structure of the sound file has these 25-second segments in it, but they don't actually last 25 seconds in performance because I'm constantly stopping and starting them. So there are kind of two alternative ways of exploring the same material taking place simultaneously. And that's one composition which I've created for the instrument, which maybe I'll play later on if anybody's interested in hearing it. So yeah, that's a kind of guided tour of the instrument, but I think it should be seen in the context of what I was talking about previously, to do with improvisation as a method of composition, and also to do with the way in which we use an instrument in improvisation to be able to demonstrate the hopefully unlimited quality of our imaginations as creative musicians. So, does anybody have any questions? Or is everybody falling asleep? Yeah. Similar to what?
Granular synthesis.
I suppose so, yes. Because, the boundary between granular synthesis and other forms of using audio material is rather fluid, right? So I can make it sound very much like granular synthesis if I want to. And granular synthesis is also something that is very important in the work that I do in fixed media music, because a technique that I keep coming back to when making fixed media compositions, which is quite strongly influenced by the structure of this instrument, is to start off by generating a sonic process which might take up not just 5 minutes but longer. So something which is gradually changing in timbre over a longer period, and then granulating that in various different ways so as to occupy maybe a sort of cloud of sounds that moves through the buffer from one end to the other, or something which is randomly choosing from all over it. So something that I've done with the fixed media part for a composition that that I wrote a couple of years ago. This is, I suppose, a good example of how granular synthesis is related to what I'm doing with the instrument here, is that I wanted to produce a gradually changing texture out of the first X harmonics of a given fundamental. So what I did is I put all of those pitches end to end in the buffer, and then put in motion a granular process which would jump between them. So you get something which was originally a kind of scale of the natural harmonic series, and then that's randomized. So that's a little bit like what I do here, except that the difference is, of course, that a granular synthesis process will do this automatically, whereas what I'm doing is kind of manual granular synthesis, if you like.
More
Granular
questions?
synthesis by hand. Okay. Well,